The galaxy had been quiet for 17 million years. 43 different species lived together in something they called the Concord of Watching Stars. Everyone knew their place. Everyone followed the rules. The Vexthari, beings made of living crystal, ran everything through perfect mathematics. The Maldara could see fragments of time moving backward, so nothing ever surprised them. The singing clusters were massive clouds of gas and light that stretched across space. And they made sure the laws of physics stayed exactly the same everywhere. Then one day, humans turned on their first faster-than-light radio. The signal was messy and loud. It leaked energy everywhere like a kid shouting in a library. But it worked somehow even though it shouldn't have. The Concord sensors picked it up instantly. They traced it back to a small yellow star with a blue-green planet orbiting it. Scans showed a young species that had only been using machines for a few hundred years. Yet somehow, these creatures had punched through the barriers between dimensions with technology that made no sense. The Concord sent Ambassador Kreoloth to investigate. He was Vexthari, over 6,000 years old, and he had negotiated peace treaties that lasted millennia. He arrived at Earth with 7 enormous ships, each one bigger than Earth's moon. The ships were made of crystal that bent starlight into beautiful, hypnotic patterns. Kreoloth expected the humans would be afraid. Maybe they would worship the Concord. That was how it usually went with new species. Instead, a human woman invited him to dinner. Her name was Dr. Sarah Chun. She represented something called the First Contact Committee, which humans had put together in about 3 weeks. She met Kreoloth's shuttle in a wheat field in Kansas. She chose the location because, as she explained cheerfully, it seemed friendly and open. Kreoloth, who had been preparing speeches about cosmic law and hierarchy, found himself completely thrown off balance when Sarah offered him something called barbecue and asked if Earth's gravity was comfortable for his crystalline body. The Concord had protocols for new species. Every newcomer had to take tests. The tests determined what role each species would play in galactic society. Some species were warriors. Some were thinkers. Some were builders. Everyone had a place, and the tests were never wrong. When the Concord explained this to humanity, humans got excited. They treated it like some kind of competition. The tests started breaking after 3 weeks. Humans didn't fit into any category. In combat simulations, they acted like suicidal berserkers one moment and patient tacticians the next. Their biology said they were predators, but their social structures looked like herd animals. They showed signs of psychic potential, but they didn't have any of the organs that made psychic abilities possible. Worst of all, humans had something they called hope. They acted as if wanting something to happen actually made it more likely to happen. Every species in the Concord agreed this was insane. The Concord held an emergency meeting. Representatives from all 43 species gathered in a space station orbiting a neutron star. They debated for 6 days. The Vexthari presented mathematical models. The Maldara examined every possible timeline. The singing clusters composed probability harmonics. Every analysis reached the same conclusion. Humanity was too unpredictable, too chaotic, too dangerous to integrate into galactic society. They would have to be quarantined, contained, studied from a safe distance until the Concord understood them better. Maybe in a few thousand years, humans would be ready. The vote was unanimous. The decision was mathematically sound, temporally verified, and harmonically balanced. The Concord prided itself on making perfect decisions. Then the Devourers arrived. The Devourers were supposed to be a myth. Old species told stories about them to explain why the Concord needed such strict rules and hierarchies. They were supposed to be monsters from the space between galaxies, creatures that ate complexity itself. They turned stars into simple hydrogen clouds. They reduced living worlds to lifeless rocks. They transformed thought into silence. The Concorde had built enormous sensor networks designed to detect devourers centuries before they could arrive, giving everyone time to prepare and evacuate. But the sensors didn't work. The devourers appeared without any warning at all, tearing through reality above Vexter Prime, the crystal homeworld. The Concorde's response was textbook perfect. Evacuation ships launched within minutes. Warforms that had been in storage for millions of years activated smoothly. Weapons capable of sterilizing entire solar systems powered up. The Concorde had practiced for this scenario for eons. The mathematics were clear. 3 billion Vextari would die in the initial assault, but the Concorde would survive. The hierarchy would remain intact. It was an acceptable loss. The protocols activated at exactly 600 hours, Galactic Standard Time. 3 minutes later, every communication channel in the Concorde suddenly filled with a human voice. It was Captain Maria Rodriguez of a ship called the ISS Defiance. According to the Concorde's tracking systems, her ship had just crossed 200 light-years in 3 days. That journey should have taken months, even with faster-than-light drives. It was impossible. Captain Rodriguez's message was short and simple. "We're here to help." The Concorde tried to explain that humanity was under quarantine. Humans didn't have the technology to fight devourers. They didn't have the understanding. They didn't have permission. They needed to go back to their solar system immediately. Captain Rodriguez said something that the translation software couldn't quite handle. The closest approximation was "watch us or possibly try and stop us." What came out of Earth's solar system wasn't a proper military fleet. It was a swarm of 10,000 ships. Some were actual military vessels. Some were mining ships that had been converted. Some appeared to be cargo haulers with weapons welded onto them. A few looked like they were held together with actual tape and luck. They flew in no recognizable formation. They had no unified strategy. They didn't even seem to be using the same communication protocols. But they came anyway. All of them, racing toward Vexter Prime at speeds that shouldn't have been possible. Ambassador Kreoloth, watching from a command ship, felt something he hadn't experienced in 6,000 years. The closest human word would have been wonder, or possibly terror. He couldn't quite tell the difference anymore. The humans were coming to help. Nobody had asked them to. Nobody had given them permission. By every law of the Concorde, they should have stayed home where it was safe. But humans, Kreoloth was beginning to realize, didn't really care about should. The first human ship to reach the battle was a converted colony freighter called Probably Fine. Its captain was a man named Jake Morrison, who had been transporting supplies to Mars when the call went out. He'd loaded his cargo bays with every nuclear weapon he could buy, borrow, or steal, and pointed his ship toward Vexter Prime. The Concorde's tactical computers tracked his approach. They calculated his trajectory. They predicted his actions with 98% accuracy. He would brake, assess the situation, and request orders. That was what any rational being would do. Jake Morrison didn't brake. He aimed his freighter directly at the largest devourer and accelerated. The Concorde's communication channels exploded with warnings. The Vextari tried to order him to stop. The Maldair, seeing his death in multiple timelines, begged him to reconsider. Jake's response was brief and cheerful. "Hold my beer." The Probably Fine hit the Devourer at 0.03% of light speed. The nuclear devices detonated simultaneously. By cosmic standards, the explosion was tiny. A Devourer was a creature the size of a moon, made of something that wasn't quite matter. The blast should have been like a mosquito bite, but the Devourer flinched. For the first time in recorded history, a Devourer reacted to something other than optimal targeting calculations. It pulled back just slightly, as if confused. as if it had felt something unexpected. Pain, maybe. Or surprise. Then the rest of humanity arrived. 10,000 ships hit the Devourer swarm like a tidal wave of chaos. The Concorde's military doctrine emphasized careful positioning, crossfire patterns, and calculated risk. Humans seemed to emphasize ramming speed, creative profanity, and something they kept calling yeeting that the translation software couldn't properly define. The battle for Vexter Prime lasted 6 hours. By every strategic model the Concorde possessed, humanity should have been wiped out in 30 minutes. They were outnumbered. They were outgunned. Their technology was primitive. Their tactics made no sense. But humans had something the Concorde didn't understand. They had spite. When a Devourer destroyed the ISS Houston, the ship next to it didn't retreat. Instead, Captain Yuki Tanaka of the Rising Sun actually accelerated toward the Devourer while broadcasting something that translated as, "You picked the wrong species." She fired every weapon she had, then rammed the Devourer's feeding tentacles, disrupting its attack pattern just long enough for 3 Vextari evacuation ships to escape. When human fighters ran out of missiles, they used their ships as missiles. When their ships were damaged, they used the wreckage as shrapnel. One pilot named Marcus Webb actually ejected from his destroyed fighter, used his suit's thrusters to board a Devourer, and planted explosives on what he thought might be important parts. He was guessing. He was probably wrong. But the Devourer's feeding pattern stuttered anyway, confused by the small creature crawling on its surface. The Concorde watched in horror and awe. These humans weren't fighting to minimize casualties or achieve strategic objectives. They were fighting because they decided the Devourers were going to lose. And reality could either cooperate or get out of the way. Chun Wei, a fighter pilot from Beijing, saved the Maldea world ship through what could only be called tactical insanity. The world ship was caught in a time distortion field that the Devourers used to age their prey into dust. The Maldea could see their own deaths coming in every timeline. There was no escape. The mathematics were absolute. Chun Wei flew his damaged fighter backward through the time field, deliberately, against all orders. He bet his life that if he moved opposite to the way time was flowing, causality would get confused enough to create a gap. It was the stupidest plan anyone had ever heard. It worked. The time field hiccuped. Just for a second. Just long enough for the world ship to slip through. Chun Wei's fighter came out the other side with him somehow alive, and his ship aged both forward and backward at the same time, which shouldn't have been possible. When the Maldea asked him why he did it, he shrugged and said it seemed like a good idea at the time. The turning point came when Captain Rodriguez coordinated what humans called the galaxy's worst idea. She got 300 ships to link their faster-than-light drives together in a way that violated every safety protocol ever written. The combined field created a bubble of accelerated time around a cluster of Devourers. Inside the bubble, millions of years passed in seconds. The Devourers, creatures that ate complexity, suddenly found themselves trying to consume the raw acceleration of entropy itself. They didn't like it. The feedback loop destabilized. 24 Devourers simply vanished, retreating back into whatever dimension they came from. The rest of the swarm pulled back, regrouping, recalculating. For the first time in their existence, Devourers had encountered prey that was more confusing than they were. In the sudden silence, Ambassador Kreoloth's crystal structure was vibrating with what might have been laughter or terror. Probably both. He opened the channel to Captain Rodriguez. "You saved us," he said, and his voice carried harmonics of disbelief. "Yeah, well," Rodriguez replied. "You seem like nice folks. Couldn't let space monsters eat you. But you were quarantined. You disobeyed the Concorde's direct orders. Sure did. Why? Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was soft but certain. Because it was the right thing to do. And because someone had to. The Concord had no response to that. In 17 million years of perfect order and calculated decisions, nobody had ever done something simply because it was right. Consequences be damned. Humanity had been in space for less than a year, and they'd already broken every rule the galaxy had. The Devourers were gone, but not destroyed. Long-range sensors showed them regrouping at the Galactic Rim. They would return. They would adapt. They would come back stronger. But now, floating in the wreckage above Vexter Prime, surrounded by humans who were already arguing about the best way to repair their impossible ships, Kreoloth felt something new crystallizing in his ancient structure. Hope. Captain Rodriguez, he said, humanity is no longer under quarantine. The Concord would like to make you an offer, yeah? Teach us what you know. 6 months after the Battle of Vexter Prime, the galaxy looked different. Not physically. The stars were in the same places. The planets still orbited. The laws of physics still worked. But something fundamental had shifted, and it was all humanity's fault. The Concord still existed, but its rigid hierarchies were developing cracks. Not because humans had conquered anyone. Humanity didn't have that kind of power. The cracks appeared because humans kept asking questions that nobody had thought to ask in 17 million years. Questions like, why do we do it that way? And what if we tried something different? And the most dangerous question of all, what's the worst that could happen? The Vexthari had designed the perfect starship. It was mathematically optimal in every way. Form, function, energy efficiency, all flawless. They'd shown the design to humanity as an example of what true engineering looked like. 3 weeks later, humans sent back 17 modified versions. Half of them exploded during testing. The other half somehow had better performance than the mathematically optimal original. When the Vexthari demanded to know how this was possible, the human engineers shrugged and said they'd just tried some stuff to see what would happen. The Moldair, who could perceive time flowing backward, discovered something disturbing about human timelines. Normally, the future was a branching tree of possibilities that collapsed into certainty as time moved forward. Human futures were different. They were tangled, quantum-locked with something the Moldair could only describe as intention. Humans could apparently make certain outcomes more likely simply by believing in them hard enough. This violated causality. It shouldn't work. It did anyway. The singing clusters, who maintained the harmonic structure of reality itself, found humans constantly introducing tiny errors into the cosmic song. They hummed off-key. They tapped rhythms that didn't match. They improvised. By all rights, this should have destabilized local space-time. Instead, the song became richer, more adaptable, more alive. Ambassador Chung, who had been given a more permanent position as liaison between humanity and the Concord, stood in her office aboard Unity Station and watched the changes ripple outward. Through the window, she could see human ships working alongside Vexthari crystal forms and Moldair timecraft. They were building something together, though nobody could quite agree on what it was supposed to be. Her door chimed. Kreoloth entered, his crystalline body refracting the station's lights into rainbow patterns. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. Sarah gestured to a chair that had been specially modified to support his structure. "Just one? That's better than yesterday. The Devourers are returning." Kreoloth projected a hologram of the Galactic Rim. Red markers indicated Devourer positions. There were millions of them. "They've been studying us, learning. They're preparing for a full-scale invasion." Sarah studied the display. Any human military analyst would have immediately started planning retreat. The numbers were impossible. Even with humanity's chaos factor, This was too much. When? She asked calmly. 18 months. The Concord's mathematicians give us a 0.03% chance of survival. So you're saying there's a chance? Quialoth's structure vibrated with what might have been a laugh. 6 months ago, he would have been horrified by that response. Now he found it almost comforting. The Concorde is beginning evacuation protocols. We'll save what we can and retreat to the outer galaxies. No. I'm sorry? Sarah turned from the window. I said no. We're not running. Ambassador Chun, I understand humans have a different perspective on acceptable risk, but this is mathematical certainty. We cannot win. You're right, Sarah agreed. We can't win by fighting them the way we fought before. So we need to try something different. Over the next 3 months, Sarah assembled a team that would have been impossible a year ago. Vexthari mathematicians worked alongside human engineers who barely understood basic physics. Maldare temporal scientists collaborated with human artists and musicians. Singing clusters provided harmonic frameworks while human children contributed ideas from their imagination. The project was called Operation Constellation. The goal was simple in concept, impossible in execution. They would build a beacon at the galactic core that would emit something that didn't technically exist. Not light, not radiation, not gravity waves. They were going to broadcast narrative causality itself. A wave of pure story that would rewrite probability based on collective will dot when Sarah presented the plan to the Grand Assembly. There was silence for a full minute. Then the Vexthari representative spoke. We've analyzed your proposal. The mathematics are sound, but the probability of success is 0.0-0-03%. So you're saying there's a chance, Sarah repeated. That's not how probability works, isn't it? You said 3 months ago that the Devourers couldn't be confused or driven off. You said humans would be wiped out in 30 minutes. You said a lot of things that turned out to be wrong. The Vexthari representative's crystal structure flickered. Because humans don't follow the rules. Exactly, Sarah said. And that's why this might work. The Devourers are creatures of pure entropy. They consume complexity and return everything to chaos. But what if we hit them with something even more chaotic than they are? What if we broadcast hope itself? The debate lasted for days. The Vexthari called it mathematically unsound. The Maldare said it existed in no successful timeline. The singing clusters found it harmonically unstable. Every species had reasons why it wouldn't work. Humanity's response was consistent. Maybe. But what if we're wrong about being wrong? In the end, the vote wasn't unanimous. But it passed. Every species in the Concorde committed resources to building the impossible. Not because they believed it would work, but because humans had taught them something new. Sometimes trying was more important than succeeding. The construction began at the galactic core, in a region of space so dense with radiation that normal matter couldn't survive. The Vexthari built the mathematical framework, even though they thought it was flawed. The Maldare anchored it across multiple timelines, even though none of those timelines showed success. The singing clusters composed the harmonic carrier wave, even though the melody made no sense. And humans? Humans did what they always did. They improvised. They tried things that shouldn't work. They made mistakes and learned from them. They argued constantly, but somehow reached consensus. They sang off-key and made the universe bend just slightly to accommodate them. The beacon grew. It was beautiful and terrible and completely unprecedented. It looked like a star, but it pulsed with rhythms that had nothing to do with nuclear fusion. It sang, but the song was made of mathematics and hope and stubborn human insistence that tomorrow could be better than today. 12 months after construction began, the Devourers arrived at the galactic rim. Sensors showed their true numbers. Not millions, Billions. An army that could consume galaxies. They had studied their prey. They had adapted. They had learned. The Concorde prepared for the end. Every evacuation ship was loaded. Every defensive position was manned. The mathematics were clear. This was extinction. Then Sarah Chan sent a message across every channel in the galaxy. It was only 7 words long. Light it up. Let's tell our story. The beacon activated at exactly midnight Galactic Standard Time. Humanity had insisted on the timing, saying it was symbolic. The Vexthari had pointed out that midnight was arbitrary in space, but they'd learned that arguing with humans about symbols was pointless. Humans cared deeply about things that didn't matter mathematically, and somehow that made those things matter anyway. The beacon didn't emit light. It didn't produce radiation. Instead, it broadcast something that the Concorde's instruments couldn't properly measure. The closest description was that it sang a story into the fabric of reality itself. A story about beings who refused to accept that the universe was cold and uncaring. A story about hope surviving against mathematical certainty. A story about tomorrow being worth fighting for. The wave expanded outward at speeds that made faster than light. Travel looked slow. It washed over stars and planets, ships and stations. Every sentient being in the galaxy felt it, even if they couldn't explain what they were feeling. The Vexthari, creatures of pure logic, found themselves experiencing something uncomfortably close to emotion. The Muldair, who saw time in fragments, suddenly perceived a linear narrative with a beginning, middle, and an ending yet to be written. The singing clusters harmonized with the beacon's melody and found their ancient song transformed into something new. And humanity? Humanity felt like they were home. The Devourers hit the outer defensive perimeter 6 hours later. There were so many of them that they blotted out entire sectors of stars. They moved with perfect coordination, their feeding patterns overlapping in ways that left no gaps, no chances for escape. They had learned from the Battle of Vexthar Prime. They wouldn't be confused again. They wouldn't flinch. The first wave of Concorde defenses lasted 18 minutes. Weapons that could crack planets barely scratched the Devourers' surfaces. Time distortion fields that should have aged them into nothing slid off like water. The singing clusters tried to disrupt their coherence with harmonic attacks. The Devourers absorbed the songs and grew stronger. Captain Rodriguez, commanding the human fleet from the ISS Defiance, watched the tactical display with a calm that surprised her. 6 months ago, she would have been terrified. Now she just felt determined. Maybe that was growth. Maybe that was insanity. The line kept getting blurrier. All ships, she broadcast. Remember, we're not trying to beat them with firepower. We're trying to annoy them to death. 1,000 human captains responded with acknowledgments that ranged from professional to profane. The human fleet broke formation, which wasn't unusual since they rarely maintained formation anyway. But this time, the chaos was deliberate. Planned chaos. Weaponized unpredictability. The Devourers had learned human tactics. They'd adapted to ramming attacks, creative explosions, and pilots doing impossible things with damaged ships. So humans did something different. They started making the Devourers laugh, or at least, that's what they tried to do. Nobody was sure if Devourers could laugh. The ship Lucky 13, captained by a woman named Rosa Delgado, flew directly at a Devourer while broadcasting Earth's entire collection of comedy routines. The Devourer tried to consume the ship. Instead, it got 3,000 years of human jokes, from ancient Greek comedy to modern stand-up. The translations were terrible. The timing was off. But the underlying pattern was pure humanity. The belief that even in darkness, laughter mattered. The Devourer paused. Just for a microsecond. But it paused. The ship, Dancing Queen, commanded by a Swedish pilot named Eric Anderson, flew a pattern that was mathematically beautiful, but tactically meaningless. He was literally dancing his ship through space while blasting classical music. When a devourer tried to predict his movements, it couldn't. Not because the pattern was random, but because the pattern was art. And art followed different rules. Across the battlefield, humans were weaponizing culture. They broadcast poetry and paintings. They sent mathematical proofs that contained intentional errors that somehow proved interesting things. They transmitted the entire history of human philosophy, complete with all the contradictions and arguments. They showed the devourers everything that made humanity human: messy, contradictory, beautiful, and absolutely refusing to make sense. The beacon's wavefront reached the devourers after 8 hours of combat. The creatures of entropy met a wave of pure narrative causality. Reality hiccuped. The devourers experienced something they had never encountered in their existence. They felt the beacon's story, and for the first time, they understood what they were destroying. Not just matter and energy. Not just complexity. They were erasing stories. They were silencing songs. They were ending possibilities. They felt doubt. Doubt was poison to creatures of pure certainty. The devourers began to destabilize. Not dying, but questioning. Their perfect coordination stuttered. Their feeding patterns broke. Some retreated. Some simply stopped moving, frozen by the paralyzing thought that maybe they were wrong. Sarah Chun, watching from Unity Station, felt tears on her face. The plan was working. The impossible, ridiculous, mathematically unsound plan was actually working. Then the largest devourer, a creature the size of a solar system, pushed through the narrative wave. It had somehow resisted. It had decided that stories were lies, hope was delusion, and entropy would always win. It headed directly for the beacon, intent on consuming the source of doubt. Every ship in the Concorde moved to intercept. They knew it was hopeless. The mathematics were clear. Nothing could stop it. A single human ship placed itself in the creature's path. It was the probably Find 2, rebuilt from wreckage after Jake Morrison's sacrifice at Vexter Prime. The new captain was Jake's daughter, Emma Morrison. She was 19 years old and absolutely furious. "You killed my dad," she broadcast on all channels. "And I'm really tired of you space jerks eating people." Emma Morrison named her ship at the Devourer and accelerated. But she didn't have nuclear weapons this time. She had something better. She had 6 months of human hope. Vextari mathematics, Muldair temporal certainty, and singing cluster harmonics all compressed into a single device that humans had named. With typical human naming conventions, the universe's middle finger, the device activated. Reality around the probably Find 2 became fluid. Probability stopped being fixed. The ship existed in multiple states simultaneously. It was there and not there. It was moving and stationary. It was destroyed and intact. The massive devourer tried to consume it and choked on paradox. Emma Morrison's last transmission was brief. "See you later, Dad." The probably Find 2 detonated, and the explosion wasn't made of matter or energy. It was made of possibility itself. The wave expanded, caught the devourer, and showed it every timeline where it lost. Every story where hope won. Every impossible outcome that happened anyway. The creature that had resisted the beacon broke. It fled back into the space between galaxies, and the rest of the devourers followed. Not destroyed. Not dead. But defeated by something they couldn't fight. Stories. The silence after the battle lasted for nearly a minute. Then every ship, every station, every being in the galaxy began broadcasting. Not words, just sound. Joy, relief, triumph, and grief all mixed together. The singing clusters harmonized with it, and for a moment, the entire galaxy sang as one. 3 months later, the Concorde formally reorganized as the Constellation Accord. The rigid hierarchies remained, but they were softer now, more flexible. The 43 species learned to work together, not through perfect calculation, but through trust and hope and the occasional willingness to try something stupid just to see what would happen. In that Kansas wheat field where first contact had occurred, they built a monument. It was made of crystal from Vexter, metal from human ships, and stones from 43 different homeworlds. The inscription was simple, written in every language of the Accord. Here, the stars learned to hope. Ambassador Sarah Chun attended the dedication ceremony. She was older now, with gray in her hair, but she smiled as she looked at the representatives from across the galaxy. Vextari, Moldair, Singing Clusters, and dozens of others. All of them changed by their encounter with humanity. A young Vextari student approached her nervously. Its crystal structure was still forming, barely a century old. "Ambassador Chun?" it asked in careful English. "I've been studying human history. I have a question. Go ahead. In your early space age, you had many disasters. Ships exploded. People died. The mathematics said you should stop trying, but you didn't. Why?" Sarah thought about Jake Morrison ramming his ship into a devourer, about Chen Wei flying backward through time, about Emma Morrison choosing sacrifice over surrender, about 10,000 humans racing toward danger because someone needed help. "Because," she said slowly, "we believe that the universe is better when we try to make it better. Even if we fail. Even if it's impossible. Especially if it's impossible." The young Vextari processed this. "That seems illogical." "It is, completely. But it works?" Sarah smiled. "Yeah, usually. Well, sometimes." "Okay. Honestly, it works more often than it should, and we're not entirely sure why." The Vextari structure flickered with what might have been amusement. "Ambassador, I've decided to study human philosophy. My elders say it will make my calculations less precise." "It probably will." "Good. Precision is overrated. I want to learn about hope." Sarah felt something warm in her chest. Pride, maybe. Or hope itself. "Then you're thinking like a human. Welcome to the club." Above them, the stars shone in their ancient patterns, burning with the same light they'd always had. But everything was different now. The galaxy had learned that sometimes the best response to darkness wasn't to calculate the odds or plan the perfect retreat. Sometimes the best response was to light a beacon and tell a better story. And if the universe didn't like it, well, the universe could deal with it. Humanity certainly wasn't planning to stop.